Hola gente bonita de internet, yo soy Catita de este canal, yo soy Pachamamista y hoy día van a ver una entrevista importante que le hice a un científico que se llama Dr. Shanna Swan. Me tomó varios meses conseguir esta entrevista porque ella es una persona muy reconocida, muy ocupada y ha salido en podcasts muy grandes, entonces tener el canal con números grandes de suscriptores me ayudó a poder conseguir esta entrevista con ella. Espero que sea muy útil para ti. Quería poner esta entrevista justamente en esta serie de videos que estoy haciendo sobre la preparación para la concepción. Su enfoque es en los químicos que están afectando a nuestra fertilidad global, tanto los animales como los seres humanos. O sea, somos animales y hay problemas de fertilidad debido a la presencia de químicos en el aire, agua, en todo. Y estos problemas afectan no solo a nosotros, sino también a los animales. Ahora, yo quise poner esta entrevista un poco antes en la serie, porque en el episodio 2 yo hablé de su trabajo y de químicos, entonces la idea original era hacerlo y tenerlo como el episodio 3, pero demoré mucho tiempo y no sabía si iba a poder entrevistarla, y ahora sí he podido, y con mucho gusto y con mucho esfuerzo le hemos traducido y subtitulado. Entonces lo pongo ahora en este momento de la serie. Espero que hayas visto o que vayas a ver los otros videos en la serie y que disfrutes esta entrevista y que sepas que aunque el mundo está súper imperfecto, que estamos como todavía con... Hay cosas que puedes hacer y las hablamos en el video, ¿no? ¿Cómo puedo lo mejor, lo mejor posible dentro de mi contexto, cómo puedo quitar algunos químicos de mi vida para poder tener una salud reproductiva y por ende una salud de todo el organismo más vibrante. Ok, disfruta la entrevista. Bye bye. Good afternoon and welcome to the Yo Soy Pachamamista YouTube channel. I am Katita and today I am joined by Dr. Shanna Swan. She is a scientist and an author. Her book Countdown is incredible, and we were just speaking about the need to translate this book into Spanish. It is a book that we're going to dive into today. Dr. Shanna Swan is an expert on fertility, infertility, what's happening with reproductive health for humanity as kind of a global issue. And this video is part of a preconception preparation series that I'm doing on my channel, because there is a lost art of preparing the body of both mother and father before conception to ensure healthy conception and then also a healthy pregnancy, especially early pregnancy. And so I'm so grateful for your time, Dr. Shanna, and also a shout out to Joe Rogan, because I know about your work through his podcast. So it's always wonderful to appear on different podcasts that have different audiences, because you never know where your work might end up and who it might influence. And I wanted to start out our conversation with a story that years ago, I went to a dermatologist, and this dermatologist was telling me about this cream that he wanted me to use. And I said, I'm concerned about this. I don't know what these ingredients are. And he said, don't worry about it. People have been using it for 50 years. And I said, well, that's exactly the time period of human history that I'm concerned about. And he looked at me like, who's this crazy lady? So yes, a lot of our conversation today is going to be talking about what has been happening the last 50 years in our bodies and what's going on and what can we do about it. So I will stop talking now and give you the floor. Dr. Shanna, I did want to give you a chance to say, what in your path, you as a scientist, brought you to where you are today and to do the work you're doing, and specifically to 2017, because that's when a big study came out and I think your work arrived to the mainstream a little bit more.
Okay. Well, thank you, Katie, for inviting me. And I'm really enjoying this opportunity to talk to your followers, I guess. So let's see, how did I get here? How did I get here on your podcast? Well, um, so I just quickly tell you that my PhD is in statistics. actually in theoretical statistics. Doesn't sound a lot like endocrine disruptors or chemicals or fertility. So there was quite a long path. So as a statistician, one of my first jobs was actually on an endocrine disruptor that we don't think about, which is oral contraceptives. So we take oral contraceptives to alter our body's hormones. That's actually what we do. It's deliberate, if you will, endocrine disruptor. You take it to change your body's hormones. So that study that I did way back in the 80s was to ask at the beginning of the use of oral contraceptives, what else were they doing to their body? Is it harming the woman's body? Is it increasing the risk of stroke, which high dose actually seemed to do? I don't want to dwell on that. That's not the topic today, but just to say that with studies like that, we learned about risks and we're able to lower exposure until they're really quite safe now. What they do to the unborn child is still a question, however, because many pregnancies are conceived while women are taking oral contraceptives. They just don't take them very well. They forget, their timing is off. And so that's something that I actually am interested in, and many people are interested, but never mind. So how did I get to 2017? So I was interested through my work in the California Department of Health, where I worked for 17 years, in the question of environment affecting women's reproductive health. Actually, at the beginning, I started with miscarriage. So I investigated this community where there had been a leak into the drinking water of solvents from a plant that manufactured chips for computers. Okay, and that contaminated water got into the homes of the residents nearby. And one of the residents noticed that there were a lot of miscarriages among her friends. And so she brought this up, and she actually did a little study and brought it to the county health officer, and they came to the state health department, and my boss said, why don't you go down there and see what's going on? And that was my first study of environmental exposures and reproductive harm. And in fact, there was a leak, and I don't want to go into that either because that's not the project today, but that was what first made me think about, yes, the environment does affect reproductive health, just as medications do, because I'd come from this oral contraceptive world. It's not just medications, it's also chemicals that get into our body through our drinking water or through other sources. And as I was working on this, I heard about a study that came out of Denmark. And that study in Denmark was in 1992. And surprisingly, it also talked about what had happened the past 50 years. And it also talked about what I'm now focusing on a lot, which is sperm count. So that study, called the Carlson study, because the first author was Elizabeth Carlson, that study said that sperm count had declined 50% in 50 years, right? Whoa, 50% in 50 years. People think, well, that's not that much, 1% per year, not so much. But if it was IQ, and you think about a 50% decline in IQ in 50 years, wow, right? So, you have to think of it, this is a big number. It's a big number. And so I looked at that paper, many people looked at that paper, and I went, I don't think so. It just didn't convince me. On the other hand, it was important. And so I decided to take it seriously, dive in, and think about this. So Katie, if you were in my field, you might say, well, sperm count going down, well, what could do that? So age, maybe the men were older, right? Maybe they smoked more. Maybe they were more obese. These are all things that can affect sperm count. Or maybe different kinds of men were brought in. So maybe in the beginning they were more fertile men, and at the end there were less fertile men, right? Subjects in the study. Or maybe the way sperm was counted changed so that the actual number, as you measured it, was less in later years because you used a different method. All right, so these are all things, we call those confounders, things that could explain the result, which is not the causal factor you're looking at. That's not a technical term, but you get the idea. So I said, the only way I can do this is actually look at all the studies and see, how did they count the sperm? How did they recruit the men? How old were the men? How many smoked? And so on and so forth, right? So I did that. It took me 9 months, and I worked with 2 colleagues in the health department. And when I was all done, so you understand, every study we had to go to, get this information, put it in the computer, control for these things. And at the end, it didn't matter at all. Did not change the results at all. So for me, that was a wake-up call, because then I had to say, I guess I have to believe this, and maybe there is something here. And if this is real, then it's important, and I want to study it. So that's how I got introduced to this area. And I'm still studying it, let's say, put it like that. So some colleagues at a meeting got together and said, let's update that 1992 study. And I think that was about 2013 that we started talking about it. And we said, we can do this better, we can do it bigger, and we can do it using modern methods, right? Because 20 years later, we had different methods. So we decided to do that. And what we did was what's called a meta-analysis. So that's a very formal procedure where you publish what you're going to do so that you're unbiased, and then you do it. So we decided to do this meta-analysis, and the question was, how much has sperm count declined? Now, let me just say, sperm has a lot of properties, and one of them is how many, that's the count. There's how many per a unit of counting, like a milliliter, that's the concentration. And then there's, how are these guys? How well do they swim? That's motility. What do they look like? That's morphology. And there's also other more sophisticated measures, like how's the DNA in these cells, and so on. So we only looked at count. And the reason we only looked at count was because, first of all, that's what's most widely published and easiest to get data on, but also the method for counting sperm has not changed. The method used now, recommended by WHO, has been recommended by WHO for, I think, 40 years. It's the hemocytometer. And so by selecting only studies that used a common method, we could ignore that question about, was it the counting method, right? So, and we couldn't look at shape or motility because those methods have changed. So we just said we won't go there. So we did this. It took us 2 years, 7 people on our team working pretty hard for no money, by the way. This was an unfunded study out of just interest. And what we found was the same thing, which was just amazing. 50% decline in 50 years. So I'll stop there, and that's how I got there, and that's our major finding in 2017.
Okay, that's a lot of good information. It's actually really fascinating that your work started out with oral contraceptives. I did not know that. I'm so glad you said that. It's very, very fascinating. And like you said, we're talking about, and we'll go into it in more detail as we go along in the interview, but we're talking about a class of chemicals called EDCs, or endocrine disrupting chemicals. And wow, like you said, maybe there are some voluntary EDCs. Oral contraceptives are, they are designed to disrupt your endocrine system. Yeah, that's really fascinating. And it is relevant to this whole series of videos, because some women who don't really understand the power that those particular EDCs have on their endocrine system maybe stop taking their pill, thinking that they'll get pregnant right away. And it might take a year or longer in order for their reproductive cycle and their estrogen, progesterone to be in a place where they can actually ovulate healthily and conceive.
Right, right.
So it's a big deal. That's fascinating. Okay,
And
so
by the way, Katie, just to mention, there are, other chemicals, medications that are EDCs that we take deliberately to change our body's hormones, right? So
right.
it would call them voluntary, voluntary endocrine disruption. So that might be men who take testosterone because of they feel, they low testosterone, or actually young people who are transitioning, you know, to another gender. They're taking it. So and there are other. So there are medications are actually part of the story, and they do have endocrine disrupting effects, but that's not what I've worked on primarily.
Right. And I guess medications are part of the story because it's inevitable that they end up in our water supply, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. And by the way, women who are trying to conceive will take hormones, medication to, regulate their cycles or whatever their problem is, and so on. So there's just lots and lots of chemicals that we take that are endocrine disruptors. But today I think we're going to talk about what are called environmental endocrine disruptors, right? Those
Right.
that come in from our environment. Yeah.
Right. And so 1992, and then fast forward, over 20 years later, and you did this meta-analysis and you confirmed once again that there's been a 50% decline in sperm count in the last 50 years. I think we should go now into the topic of phthalates, which is one of those environmental endocrine disrupting chemicals that you just talked about. I think that that's important to go into the phthalate AGD story. It's important for many reasons, and also important for us to understand that what happens in utero, it is the most vulnerable time for a human.
Right.
Because
And
the
other species too. Yes. Right. Right. So the vulnerability of the unborn offspring was first demonstrated in rats and mice, and with respect to phthalates. So all of the initial work for the risks of phthalates on reproduction came from rats and mice, right? And that's because, so here's the sequence. Until around 1999, something like that, it was not easy to find out what chemicals were in people's bodies. So if I want to find out how much phthalate is in your body, or how much bisphenol or so, I can do that by getting some sample from your body. And depending on, we'll talk about this later, which the chemical is that we want to look for, that'll sort of guide what sample I'll look at. But so for phthalates, we want to look in the urine because they're water soluble. And so that's what CDC did. And so CDC, Centers for Disease Control in the United States, instituted a program by which they would look inside people's bodies by looking at their urine and detecting whatever chemicals they could in the urine, and do that every 2 years, to see how, what was the trend of these chemicals? Was it increasing? Was it decreasing? Was it more prevalent in men or women or young or old or black or white? So they wanted to understand what people were exposed to. And when that became a national program, then we saw that phthalates were actually in everybody, including almost 100% of pregnant women, men, and so children, everybody. And that was kind of a wake-up call. So I was flying to Japan with a friend who worked for CDC, and he said, Shanna, you should study phthalates. So I said, what are phthalates? So that's how ignorant I was. And he told me this of what he was measuring at CDC. And then he said, and this is the important part really for me, he said, and my colleagues in the National Toxicology Program have shown in animal studies that when the pregnant mom is given these phthalates in her food, right, in early pregnancy that her sons, except they're pups because they're rats and mice, are born with their genitals slightly incomplete. So we can talk about what that means and in terms of HD, but that was and that they actually called, pretty soon they gave it a name and they called it the phthalate syndrome. So you probably won't know this because you're not directly working in the field, but there's no other chemical. There's not a BPA syndrome, and there's not a PFAS syndrome. You know, phthalates is the only one that was singled out for this syndrome in males. So, you know, it was already very important. And so I thought, wow, well, what about people? And that's how I got there. So then we can go on from there.
So I think we should cover what is a phthalate, how are we interacting with them? And then also, this is a little bit separate, but it seems like there is a BPA syndrome. Is it just because we haven't focused on that? You know, or there is for sure, or is it not as clear cut? Because I mean, I'll just put that to the side a little bit because we're going to go down phthalates and you'll explain to us what that syndrome is. But it just seems like probably so. There is some sort of, I don't know if it's as clear cut of a
right. So phthalates are they're a large class of chemicals. They're actually expanding all the time as new forms are manufactured. And what they are called plasticizers. So they're added to plastic to give the plastic certain properties. So phthalates make plastic soft and flexible. But I just want to add, they do lots of other things. They have lots of other properties that are good for various industrial uses. For example, they increase absorption. So if you're adding cream to your skin, you're putting cream on your skin, it goes in, right? And phthalates help that. They help the penetration of the chemical into your skin. So they're put in lots of personal care products, and they're also put in personal care products because they hold the scent, they keep the smell in. So they're added to all of scented products. You know, your laundry detergent and your plug-in in the wall freshener, and you know, the pine cone in your car, and all of those things have that. Anything you smell. Okay, I mean a pleasant smell, I guess. And they also hold color, so they're put in lipstick, they're put in nail polish. So these are some of the major uses of phthalates. But the one that's most concerning, I think, is the plastic tubing. So the use in plastic tubing makes the tubing soft, flexible. Those are properties you want for your tubing. But one property of these phthalates is that when they're added to the plastic, they are not chemically bound to the plastic. So they can hop out, if you will. And they do that if the material going through the tube is warm and liquid. And that causes a huge problem. For example, most dramatic is in the neonatal intensive care nursery. That's not exposure most of your listeners will be, hopefully be seeing, but though you've seen pictures of those little tiny infants in their little plastic boxes and all these tubes coming into them, which are all containing phthalates. So many researchers, particularly a colleague of mine at Mount Sinai, have shown that you can measure in the urine, you know, a direct correlate of how many tubes are put into the baby. Mm-hmm. It's also true for other places in the hospitals, you know, so you can imagine, you know, chemotherapy and transfusion and all of these introduce phthalates into the body. So makes it a little tricky when you're trying to do no harm and yet you're introducing these products. So why are they a problem? So they're a problem because they have, like oral contraceptives, they change the body's hormones. and phthalates in particular lower testosterone. So that immediately makes problems for reproduction because the reproductive system of both men and women depend on testosterone. So these little rats that were born to the mother who was exposed to these phthalates have had their testosterone reduced at a critical time in their development. So the development in utero is programmed like a ballet.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's really carefully programmed in terms of timing, who enters at what time, what they do. And that information, of course, is in our genes. But so there's some point, we don't know the exact day in humans. In rats, it's between gestational days 18 and 21. So a very small window. And in that time, the testicles are forming and they're making testosterone. And that testosterone then goes in many places in the body, including the genitals, what will be the genitals. And under the influence of this hormone, if it's a genetic male, he will start developing male typical genitals. Okay, and we can talk about exactly what happens, but if you want. But the critical thing here is that if the testosterone is not there at the right time, think of a ballet or a trapeze artist. You've got to catch right? Catch your partner. If you're not there, big trouble. That's what happens in utero if the testosterone is not there at the right time. And then the testicles don't form or don't form completely, and then they don't descend, and the penis doesn't enlarge, and then this distance, which I've spent a lot of time studying and helping others to use, which is a measure of the whole length of the genital area or the perineum, called the anogenital distance, which gets longer and longer in a genetic male, doesn't really get as long as it would if there was enough testosterone there. So that's kind of what's happening in that critical time, why it needs testosterone and what happens if it doesn't get the testosterone. By the way, females don't need much testosterone. They have it some, but they're the default here. So the genital tract is female, and then it becomes male in a genetic male under the influence of testosterone. It's kind of surprising, right?
Right. The default is female. And then around 6 or 7 weeks is when the ballet needs to start sending signals of testosterone if the genitals are going to differentiate and become male.
Yeah, we don't actually know that it's 6 or 7 weeks. Here's the why. We know it's early first trimester, right? So in rats, you can really get it down to a day because you know exactly, you write down, gave the mother phthalates, right? So you can say, okay, if I give the mother phthalates between 18 and 21, this will happen. If I give it only before or only after, no change.
Mm-hmm.
So we can't do that experiment in humans because ethically, you cannot, assign a phthalate exposure to a pregnant woman. Mm-hmm. Unethical. Important to keep in mind, right?
Right.
Yes. Yeah. But so all we can do is observe. And so we can take urine samples from the women at different times, see how much phthalate is in them, see what happens to the baby. And we did that. And we showed that these changes occur when the exposure is in the first trimester, not in the second and third trimesters. But we can't go finer than that because we don't have that many urine samples for hundreds of women,
I understand. You're not taking at 1 week, 2 week, 3 week plus.
Right, exactly.
Plus women many times don't know that they're pregnant until later, yeah. Which is why preconception preparation is important and nice when it can happen, because then you know that you're pregnant, because these first couple of weeks of pregnancy are so important. So, okay. Phthalates are water soluble. We already talked about that. We talked about the CDC measuring phthalates in urine, and that's what you've done as well. So then the question is, well, how long does it take? Let's pretend that we did live in some sort of sterile lab and someone gave me a bunch of phthalates to ingest and then gave me some water to drink. Could I get rid of all of those phthalates in a
Yes,
week? A
yes,
week?
yes. That's the nicest property of phthalates, actually. They pass through the body with a half-life of 4 hours, really fast. That's the good news. The bad news is that you're continually replenishing the supply of phthalates into your body. So you have to make a really big effort to be phthalate free. There's a very nice book called Slow Death by Rubber Duck.
Hmm.
And the authors did a little experiment. The two men did a little experiment. They set up a lab in the home of one of them, and I actually talked to them about what they should stop doing. And so they did all these things to be phthalate free and bisphenol A free and PFAS free and all these other things. And they showed that their levels went down when they stopped doing X, Y, and Z. We can talk what X, Y, and Z are, but pretty soon they went down. So that's great. So your listeners your followers will know, can know. And by the way, if you read Countdown, we have very specific things they can do.
Hola, gente bonita. Espero que estén disfrutando mucho esta entrevista. Yo tengo muchas entrevistas útiles en el canal y muchos videos útiles en el canal y mucha información escrita útil en mi blog yo soy pachamamista.com. Y si quieres apoyarme, te pido y te agradezco tu apoyo. Yo tengo cursos pagados, no solo tengo esta información gratuita, sino también tengo cursos pagados que son muy bonitos, muy útiles. Me gusta hacer cosas útiles para el mundo. Y cuando compras los cursos y los ebooks que tengo, estás apoyando también mi trabajo que hago aquí en el canal. Por ejemplo, traduciendo y subtitulando esta entrevista. Ahora, en abril 2023, estoy dentro de una ventanilla de preventa de mi libro sobre la herbolaria. Estoy reformateando el libro para poder venderlo en forma digital para que pueda llegar a más personas. Entonces, mira, aquí está el libro. Si tú participas en la preventa, vas a recibir al final del mes este libro sobre los vehículos de medicina, o sea, los vehículos, agua, por ejemplo, alcohol, glicerina, vinagre, aceites, grasas. Todos estos son vehículos que podemos usar para transformar las plantas en infusiones, decocciones, tisanas, hidromieles, sodas, pomadas, compresas. Hay muchas maneras de transformar las plantas. Dependiendo de la planta y con qué parte de la planta estamos trabajando, vamos a elegir un vehículo o otro. También depende de la persona y de la cosa que estamos trabajando y mejorando en la persona. Entonces, si todo esto te interesa, incluso si eres más avanzado o principiante en el camino de las plantas medicinales, este libro te puede ayudar mucho. Y como agradecimiento por participar en la preventa, también estoy ofreciendo otras cosas, otros ebooks súper bonitos, también videos, también un webinar en vivo conmigo, todo lo que tiene que ver con la salud y las plantas este mes de preventa. Para poder participar, te dejo el link debajo de este video. Y si estás mirando este anuncio fuera de la ventanilla de abril 2023, no te preocupes porque puedes comprar el libro o quizás haya otro curso o libro que te interese más en mi página yo soy pachamamista.com y así estás recibiendo algo súper bonito y también estás apoyando este proyecto. Gracias y volvamos a la entrevista. Estoy muy agradecida. Bye.
And they should make these changes, I mean, I would say right now, but most critically, when they want to start trying to have a baby. But as you pointed out, sometimes people don't know they're pregnant or they get pregnant without trying. And so I would say, to be on the safe side, the sooner the better if you think you might conceive a child. By the way, it's not just the woman that has to change her exposures, it's the man as well.
Mhm.
I don't know if you want to talk about that right now.
I definitely want to talk about that because so basically what we're saying is there's this big class of chemicals called phthalates. Sometimes I say phthalates, but phthalates. And when the mother and father are exposed to phthalates and then they conceive and this, growing group of cells that becomes a fetus, that whether it's going to be a female or a male, it will lower testosterone in that baby. For a male, it has lasting repercussions because when that baby is born and we measure its anogenital distance, it's going to be shorter. And that has implications for that male baby's life, even when he's an adult. But I do think it's important to talk about that the dad's exposure to phthalates is also important. So much of infertility issues, of course, lands on the woman. And we don't even consider that it could be an issue of the man.
Right, absolutely. And, so a woman is born with all the eggs she's going to have. So her eggs are pretty much, set. And the damage that from phthalates and other chemicals through the female side is what's going into her body and affecting the embryonic development of the fetus. But the male is making sperm all the time. So it takes 70 days to make a sperm. So in the 70 days before conception, an exposure can damage the sperm that will go on to conceive that pregnancy. And so for a male, if the couple has the, ability to select the time that they're going to actually be trying to conceive, that 70-day window, I would say, was most critical for male exposure. There are some things, habits, like smoking is a risk factor for later reproductive dysfunction, later low sperm count. Adult men whose father was smoked before they were conceived has a 50% lower sperm count.
Wow.
And that's similar to what he experiences if his mother smoked when she was pregnant, particularly in the first trimester. And those changes to his sperm cannot be repaired. Those are fixed because that fetal development is permanent. If he smokes, the man himself, he will also reduce his sperm count, but it's probably half of that reduction. And he can fix it because if he stops smoking, he can get his sperm count back. So that the good news is that, if you're a smoker or if you're doing other things that can damage your reproductive success or impair your reproductive success, which we should talk about, you can make those changes and they will have an immediate effect of helping your chances of getting pregnant. But if the damage has been done in utero, like I said, this will be a permanent change. It will not be fixable. So that's kind of heavy, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is because one of the issue with the higher phthalate level in utero, male baby is born shorter AGD. That male baby grows up and is going to have a lower sperm count. That
Right.
not only affects his ability to reproduce, it affects his longevity as well.
Absolutely. That's right. Right. And that's something that most people don't know, that both men and women, by the way, who have lower fertility, impaired fertility, have a shorter lifespan. That news has just come out in the last couple of years. It's really kind of a shocker because it says it's not just your blood pressure or your cholesterol or these other things that have been measured by your doctor that are important for your long-term health. It's also these markers of fertility. So some people are saying sperm count should be considered, the third vital sign or the fifth vital sign or however many vital signs you keep track of, but a vital sign that it tells you something about your overall health. That, by the way, is one of the reasons why I think men should get their sperm count tested, so they know that about themselves. That and the fact that, most men don't know, you know.
Right. It makes sense to do, like you say, it's just as a marker of your health in general, whether or not you want to reproduce.
Exactly.
Where am I at with my health?
Yeah.
So you mentioned a few things. Phthalates are found in products with scent. So we would avoid scented cleaning products and detergents. Phthalates are found in soft plastics, especially in connection with warm things. So we would avoid plastics in the kitchen, especially no microwaving in plastic. I also think it's so common for people to have, plastic spatulas or plastic spoons. So that's another kind of basic thing. Let's go to metal or wood.
Right. Right. Yeah. And storage containers too. Yeah. So glass,
Glass storage containers.
Right.
Cutting out plastic drinking, so plastic water bottles, for example, is another, that's like step zero.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, metal is good alternative for that. Yeah. So steel water bottles.
I know, because you know what the issue is? I left this down here on purpose to show you is, for example, I don't drink water, plastic water bottles. Sometimes I do, actually, if I'm at the airport and I'm so
Sure.
thirsty.
Yeah.
So, because then it becomes the question, oh my gosh, what's worse, the tap water at the airport or the plastic water?
I don't know that, because just to add in here, I studied water for many years, and bottled water often it was not regulated and might very well be tap water from some other tap. So just be careful which which bottled water. Yeah.
So, but for example, I really like coconut water, and I get this coconut water from Trader Joe's, but I know because I have listened to your information. For example, in the inside of this, it's slippery. There's like there's something in here, or a lot of paper cups have, kind of
Lining, right. Mm-hmm.
that, though it might not be phthalates, but they are endocrine disrupting chemicals in that.
Right. Those barriers, they're probably of PFAS chemical. So the PFAS chemicals are the barrier chemicals. So they're put on your pan, for like Teflon, or you maybe on your jacket, to keep the water, water repellent, and also your pizza boxes. So you know how there's kind of slick under the pizza. So that's how the oil doesn't go through and get into, the hands of the people carrying the pizza box. Yeah, so they're all over, and it's really hard to avoid them and to know what's safe. I mean, not all plastics are equally bad, and this is certainly not my, I'm not a chemist, and I'm not material specialist. So, and it's changing all the time. So which plastics are better and worse is very difficult to determine. And that's maybe why, if possible, you just kind of stay out of the game altogether and just try not to use them at all. That's very difficult, very, very difficult. But there's a little help from the recycling code underneath. And we used to say 4, 5, 1, and 2, all the rest are bad for you, right? But not so much anymore, because now we know that even the 1 and 2s could convey some estrogenicity. So it's complicated, and it's changing. It's a changing landscape. So, I would just say, to the extent possible, use a steel water bottle. And as far as water coming in your pipes, I just want to mention there's a big discussion now going on in the United States about what is in our water pipes. What is the water picking up from the pipes? And it turns out, as you probably know from some press, that in some cities there's a lot of lead that gets picked up from the water pipes. And so that's going to be phased out, fortunately, under a very big, amount of money set aside by Biden to remove lead from certain water pipes, then not all of them, but what do we use? And that our group, my colleagues and I are discussing, well, what should we use then? And one of the things you don't want to use, and which they're proposing to use, is PVC,
Mm.
polyvinyl chloride, because you're just jumping out of the frying pan into the fire, so to speak. So there are safer alternatives. They might be more expensive and maybe political reasons. I don't want to go into that now, but I'm just saying the water that comes out of your tap doesn't necessarily, that's not necessarily totally okay for you, even if you store it in stainless steel.
Right. Here in this house where I live, there is a reverse osmosis filter for the whole house, which
Yeah,
is great.
yeah,
A whole filter. A lot of people, they don't have a whole house filter, but they at least filter their water and then maybe also have a filter for their shower, which is really nice and important. But then the question becomes, because I've talked about filtering water before and people say, well, the parts on the filter are plastic. So it's just, the parts on the actual filter, I mean, there's some plastic in that. So yeah, it's not perfect, but it's certainly better than maybe drinking tap water or buying all your water in bottles. One thing I mentioned in the list of questions I sent you is that in other places, specifically in Latin America, there's a lot of water in plastic. In Mexico City, the way that you get water, most people get water, from what I've experienced living there, is that you just call up and people order these like big jugs, and they bring them. They're not soft plastic, so it's not phthalates, it's BPA, it's hard plastic, but they're reused. So does it get better or worse when plastic waters are reused? Because is it like, okay, there's phthalates that, oh yeah, now the phthalates are gone, but then the plastic itself is used. It's a tough situation. It's a tough situation when you are even just starting at step one, which is, where should my water come from and how should I filter it?
yeah, yeah. And let me just say, I talked a lot about phthalates, but BPA is also not good for reproductive health. And so, and it's kind of the evil twin of phthalates in a way, because it makes plastic hard, not soft, and it increases estrogen as opposed to decreasing androgen, but it's hormonally active and it's a hazard to your reproductive health. So, and particularly to women. So just, BPA is not a good thing. But I just want to mention there is one alternative, which I don't understand why it isn't more widely used, and that's distillation. So I'm in this house, I'm in a little house here in San Francisco. We have a distiller on our countertop, and we just run a batch every day. It's free. Well, the machine itself is a couple $100, but after that, every day your water's free and it's clean. And I've never heard anybody say, anything bad about it. So I don't know why it's not more widely used. It's
I've
not good in showers, of course, but yeah.
well, I've heard people say that distilled water is because it's devoid of minerals, it could actually dehydrate your body. Do you add minerals back to that water?
Yes. And not to the water, but I take supplementation. I take
Oh,
mineral supplementation. Yeah.
got you.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's good to know. And interesting. Yeah, you can definitely buy distilled water, but it comes in plastic, so it kind of
Yeah.
defeats.
And it's expensive.
Right, right.
Whereas distilling your own water is free. So, okay. So where are we?
Well, so yes, all of this makes sense. I wanted to talk about, because we've talked about phthalates, we've talked about BPA. Both of those are water soluble chemicals, and fat, which can be measured with urine. Fat soluble chemicals are trickier because they're stored in fat in your body. So,
Well, they're in your serum. You can measure them in serum.
blood.
Blood, yes, you can measure it. Which is always more difficult, to get a serum sample than a urine sample, but it's not as hard as getting a fat sample. You're getting a fat sample, good luck, that's only if somebody's going in for liposuction, you can get a fat sample, but or surgery for some other purpose. So yeah, the you know, the legacy chemicals, the ones that were banned, like DDT and PCBs and dioxins, those are the worst actors, so to speak. They're really sticking around in the environment, in fish, in our soil for a very, very long time, years and years. And they do stay in the body. They stay in our fat. I cannot tell you how the measurement of persistent chemicals in serum and fat compares. I don't know that, because fat is not used epidemiologically because it's very, very hard to get. Serum is used very commonly, not as commonly as urine. But in addition to the legacy chemicals, there are what's called the forever chemicals, which are more modern chemicals that stick around a long time. And those are the brominated flame retardants and pesticides and the PFAS chemicals, and those are the barrier chemicals. You know, the things that set up barriers, like, you know, between, well, we talked about it a little bit, your Teflon and your waterproof jackets and things like that. So there's lots of classes of these, and their chemical properties determine where they're stored and where you can access them. And for me as an epidemiologist, what's important is how can I measure them? Because you can't ask, you can say somebody, how many cigarettes did you smoke, or did you take this medication? But you can't say, did you take your phthalates today? You know, because, you know, so you have to have a way to get into the body. And now, pretty alarmingly, we are finding out that not only these chemicals, but the breakdown products of plastic, now called, determined by their size, nano or micro particles. Have you heard of this? Microplastic and nanoplastic. Those are found in all over the body. So they've been found in the placenta. They've been found in, talking about sperm, seminal fluid, the sample that a man gives has microparticles of plastic in it. Think about that.
Yeah, that's incredible. It doesn't become inside of the cell. It doesn't enter the cell. Is it in the, what do they call it? Interstitial fluid, the fluid around?
I don't know. This science is really new, and actually just measuring it at all is, we're kind of back to where we were with the measurement of phthalates in urine back in 1999, right? Because we don't know how to do this. And a sample now, I just got a quote from a lab, $1,200, because I want to do this study. I want to get the semen sample of a man and see what's in it, what microplastics are in it, and this lab told me $1,200. That's compared to, in urine, phthalates or bisphenols is $120 or $140. You know, so it's prohibitively expensive for large epidemiological studies. So it'll be quite a few years before we really understand what's happening with these chemicals in the body. But they're there, and they're alarming. You know, it's also in stool. So we know it's in the microbiome, it's in the gut. It's been found in lungs. Nobody's looked in the brain yet, as far as I know, but that's pretty scary. So I just throw that out there, that, you know, it doesn't stop with the chemicals themselves.
Right. So when I've shared your work before, and maybe even now when someone's listening to this, they might think, wow, we are doomed and this is not a good situation. It is easy to, in any situation, to arrive to a place of hopelessness and then become stagnant. Like, well, it doesn't really, it's such a huge problem that even tiny improvements might not make a dent in what the issue is. So I do want to acknowledge that there is still, despite this, how much we don't have control over in terms of what's in our air and our water and, you know, in the places that we live and in these things that we buy, there is still a lot that is under, maybe not a lot, but a good amount that's under our control.
Wow, that, you know, trying to estimate what percent that is, I wouldn't want to try to do that.
Right.
But I think, um, like I said, you know, from the guys who did slow death by rubber duck, they were able to lower their exposure measurably and pretty dramatically by taking these steps. Now, what they did was more than any one person would do. You know, they set up a room in which they lived. They everything that came in, they controlled. You know, they were very, very careful how to do that. So is it possible? Is it practical? Certainly not that extent. But are there things you can do that are pretty easy that you can, you know, yes. And I would say I would say, think about this. Food is the #1 source of exposure.
Right.
Okay. So if you can get a handle on your food and where you buy it and what kind of food, and I want to talk about that in a minute, and how you store it and how you cook it, you're going to be a long way to, reducing your exposure. Okay. So now I just have to mention that I recognize that not everybody can afford to buy organic food, and not everybody can afford to buy unprocessed food or to stay away from fast food restaurants, which are, by the way, a good source of high exposure. Roughly, you can think about, price goes up as exposure goes down. Unfortunately, that's true for a lot of things. However, if you have the good fortune of living near a farmer's market, and you can, and particularly if you can go to the stalls that say organic and buy organic food, take it home and, not wrap it in plastic and put it in, paper or cloth or, some other container. And yeah, then when you go to cook it, just avoid Teflon, and just eat it. You're going to have now, but this is a suggestion for people who can afford it. And so I just want to mention that people who are disadvantaged have a much higher time dealing with this problem than people who have more resources, not only financial resources, but also time and also information, which is not equally distributed. So this is not an equal opportunity solution. So I can tell you, do this with your food. You can do it. It'll take a lot of effort. It takes time. If you've got, a bunch of kids running around, or you have to do 2 jobs, you're not going to have time to do this. Right. So I just want everyone to recognize that, don't be too hard on yourself if you can't take the time or can't afford to make these changes.
Mm-hmm. Right. We're living in a system that's anti-life, really. So then we talk about how do we create an environment that supports thriving life, and we are very, very far from that as a species, but we're on the track to, some of us are on the track to how can we figure out how to support thriving life on Earth. So it is true. And like you say, for example, I think about lower income people that might live near a factory, or might live near an airport, or might live near a dump or something. So it's difficult because
yeah. So exposure level goes up as the economic situation goes down. Isn't, that's been well established. But the other thing to remember is there's just so much that we can do ourselves. So much, only so much we can buy our way out of, by buying better products and, organic food and so on. And really what has to happen is that the government has to do it, and that's not happening. It's happening much more in the EU than in the US. I'm sure it's happening not very well in South America, but I don't know the details. I know something about Brazil where I've done some work, but it's people can't really manage this themselves because they don't have the information and they don't have the resources. So it's really and they don't have, we don't know what's in our product. And people assume drugs are pretty well regulated by the FDA, and people think, well, anything that's commercial, it's in the supermarket, we're allowed to buy it, it's got to be okay. But that's not true.
Right. Right. Yeah, I hear that. And I also think, gosh, thinking that the government might make some significant changes that support thriving life is wishful thinking. Or I don't know. So it does feel a little bit daunting. I can totally relate to the people who go, because I mean, we all have, know that we touch sometimes despair and hopelessness, but right. I at a macro level, there needs to be changes that are systemic, and that is something that an individual can't do, although there's a lot you can do in your own life. You said something to talk about food. I mean, just to give you an example, and I know we don't have too much time left, but we'll touch on this and then one more thing, and then I'll let you go. My thought about, for example, I buy milk from the farmer's market. From this great farmer. I buy raw milk actually, and he does milk his cows with a machine, because if you have more than a couple of cows and you're milking twice a day, it's not, it's
Right.
So
Right.
he milks with the machine, so that's phthalates in the plastic tubing, and then he does put it in plastic, milk jugs, because he doesn't do the whole, bring your jugs. It makes it easier, really. It's just easier. So I buy that. Do you think, for example, if I get this beautiful raw milk, beautiful heavy cream, all this, but if I get home, it's, instead of leaving it for the week in the jug, I pour it into a glass container. Is that a good idea, or does it matter at that point because of its exposure to the phthalates?
Oh, Katie, I don't know. I really
Okay.
don't know. I would say put it in glass, because it's going to be in that container for a while, and it could definitely pick up additional exposure, right?
Mm.
What proportion of the exposure that is, I can't say. But I'm glad you mentioned the milking story, because I know that there's been studies showing that hand milked cows produce milk with no phthalates in them, and machine milk cows have phthalates in them, even if it's organic. So yeah, it's an ongoing battle. That's all I can say. We just do the best we can, right? Yeah.
Yes, it seems as though maybe you would want to find some sort of bubble you could conceive. You could go to some mountain cabin and conceive there and spend the first 8 weeks of the pregnancy there, and then go back to civilization, something like this. But again, I'm talking really elitist stuff here, because people can't really do that. But like, I'm just imagining. So I did want to mention before we leave, because a lot, and I've heard people discuss this in other interviews with this as well. This is the fact that globally our fertility rate. I know you say sperm count is 50% less over the last 50 years, but also fertility. We can
Yes.
say fertility.
Right.
That
So when I say fertility, what and people using this technically, we're talking about total fertility rate, which is the number of children that a couple can expect to have in their lifetime. Yes? Okay. Good.
Okay, so the global fertility rate has dropped by over 50% in the last 50 years,
Right. About the same rate as sperm count.
about the same rate as sperm count. And sperm count is just one of the factors in that fertility.
Exactly. And we have so much to talk about and so little time, it seems, but I do want to mention, because I only touched on briefly, that I'm not saying, particularly with respect to fertility, that chemicals are the only problem or the only factor that's playing a role here. As far as, lifestyle, smoking, binge drinking, diet, obesity, exercise, stress, all of those things affect your fertility.
Right.
And so, while you're changing things, please don't forget those things, because those are very important, not only for fertility, but also for your heart health and your metabolic health and so on and so forth. So, those recommendations, which are pretty standard, are important for fertility as well. Yeah. And yeah, okay, I'll stop there. Yeah.
Globally, this means that humans are endangered. Like, it's so fascinating that so many people think, oh, humans, that we're just gonna just keep going up in numbers, and basically we're terrible parasitic creatures for the earth. And when the truth of the matter is that we are experiencing, and it will continue to amplify, a population decline that might come to kind of an abrupt, massive change for us.
Yeah. So it's very counterintuitive. Everyone feels there's too many people on the planet, and there's a lot of people on the planet, and we're not doing very well at sustaining ourselves, But there's a wonderful book called Empty Planet by Daryl Bricker, and what he makes a very good case for a projection that the population will continue to increase, perhaps till 2040, 2050, and then it will drop, and then it will never come back.
Hmm.
And the reason is, just briefly, because it's a whole book and I can't possibly give it, do it justice, but many of the factors that affect the decline in fertility are things that we will not voluntarily change. So more women in the workplace, and more education of women, and broader distribution of contraception, and urbanization. All of these things decrease fertility. And these are all going up, and these are all things that people want. So, back in 1960, there were 5.4, I think, children per couple on average in the world. And now and in 2019, it was I think it's 2.54. So if there's 2 or 2.1, that's replacing. And if you're below 2, then you're not replacing yourselves, because you have a couple of 2 people out there. So the lowest in the world now is South Korea, and their fertility is 0.89. So that means they're not even replacing one member of the couple on average.
Hmm.
Extremely low in a lot of East Asian countries. And here's the thing. The governments are trying to turn this around. They're giving economic incentives, housing and tax breaks and supplements for having more children, and it is not working, because, as I said, people don't want to have a lot of children, and some don't want to have any children. There's also a related question, which is the decline in testosterone, which we haven't talked about, except through phthalates lowering testosterone. But there is a global decline in testosterone, and testosterone is related to a lot of things that drive, you to get married and have children. Hormonally, that's and have sex, by the way,
Well,
and
for
so
men and women.
yeah. So this is all decreasing, and just a nice weird example is that in Japan, they have a phenomenon now where women are marrying themselves, having
Yeah.
ceremonies to marry themselves. And just think about that, and they also have rent a family, where, if you don't happen to have a husband or children, you go into an event where you want to have a husband or a child, you rent them. Okay. It's just pointing out that this is, in some places in the world, a really severe problem.
It doesn't really seem as though we will avoid some sort of crash-like situation. As an individual, you tend to make changes when your life is like obliterated, and I don't know that you're sounding these alarms and talking about these chemicals and talking about the fertility rate drops. I I I don't really see us turning this Titanic around. But you know, I mean, but that doesn't make it, it makes it so we still want to learn and do the best that we can in our own lives. But it definitely seems like, wow, the next 50 years is going to be a particularly fascinating section of human history.
Yes, and I expect that as is we're seeing now, the number of children, proportion of children born by assisted reproduction is going to go up,
Right.
medically assisted in various ways. And I think more countries are going to have to provide payment for that, which is done in very few countries right now. So and I believe that science will find new and better ways to, for assisted reproduction. And that's what we're going to rely on a lot of the time. Yeah.
I guess the tragedy of that is, I've heard, for example, in some of your interviews, that they have shown that a male baby born from assisted reproduction technology grows up to be a man with a lower level of fertility, maybe lower testosterone or lower sperm count. I'm not sure, or both. I'm not sure, but there are consequences.
There are consequences. And we didn't really talk about this, but if a woman today is pregnant and exposed to these chemicals in ways that alter the child she's carrying, that child has within her, him, the germ cells for the later generation. So the mother is affected, and the fetus is affected, and the fetus's offspring is affected. And we don't know how long that goes, but we know that at least for 3 generations, your exposure today is going to affect the reproductive success, whether it's artificial or not, of your offspring. Yeah. So if it's been shown that in animal studies, if you stop exposure for 3 generations, you can turn this around, which is good news. And the bad news is that 3 generations for humans is about 75 years, and I'm not sure what's going to happen, before that time, if we could stop right now. And stopping right now doesn't seem to be in the forecast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really fascinating, but I do want to, finish on this note of there are things that we can do, and what you mentioned, which is great, is focus on your food. Where's your food coming from? And how can I, even if I don't have a lot of resources, I can at least start using a wooden spoon or a metal spoon to stir my soup instead of a plastic one. Like, I can get rid of Teflon and use cast iron. I can change out my Tupperware for glass containers. So I can really make an effort to not use bottled water and not buy drinks in plastic bottles. So those things are a good step in the right direction. And so that's what we want to focus on, and acknowledge this severity of the situation that we're in as a species, and how much these chemicals impact us, impact our babies in utero, and then impact their fertility. Because the whole point is we not only want to be fertile, we want to have children that could reproduce, children that are fertile. So it's a big conversation, and a lot of what this series is focusing on also is like food quality, and what are foods that actually nourish fertility. And so this is one piece of the puzzle, but I'm so grateful for your time and so grateful for your research, and definitely will support you in any way I can to get your book published in Spanish, because it's very important. So do you have any final words to leave us with before we end our call today?
Just that I thank you for this opportunity to talk to your followers. And I think that's what I've been doing a lot of since the book came out 2 years ago, talking to as many people as possible, because I think that's how we're going to get change, because people are going to talk about it. They're going to tell their friends about it. They're going to tell their children about it. And maybe together we can, turn this around.
Totally. I agree. And I'm so grateful. that you have chosen this as your mission, because we needed we needed a captain. We needed a captain on the ship of daylights, phthalates. So thank you so much, Dr. Shanna, for your time. I'm very grateful, and I'm excited to share this with my audience, and will continue to point them in the direction of the information that you're sharing so that we can be better informed about what's going on.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank
Bye.
you. Have a great day.